I don't really remember how long ago it was that Luke and I started talking about him taking an extended break this summer. But whenever we started talking about it, I very quickly started looking at the calendar. I was trying to figure out what dates were going to be open or available for me to preach and kind of what other events were going on here in the life of the church. And then prayerfully considering what direction the Lord wanted me to go with the Sundays I was afforded the opportunity to preach, all until I decided, at least for the first part, to settle on a 2-week sermon series on the book of Ruth. Now, this sermon series, though I've kind of adjusted it somewhat, was a series that I'd already preached at a previous church. But as I was working back through these messages, I felt the Spirit of God bring this idea to mind. Creating a resource for our church family that corresponds with the sermon series in the book of Ruth, but can actually be utilized outside of the worship gathering, kind of like a daily devotional. And the more I thought about this idea, the more intrigued I became. I was actually really interested in what this could look like, even though I've never really done anything quite like this before. To build something from scratch like this, it was a little nerve-wracking and actually really exciting. So as I was working through the outlines of the messages, I would also work back through the book of Ruth itself and highlight a verse here or there that I felt would make sense to kind of fit into a 10-day window, to where then I would gather my notes together and I would look at any sort of cross references to New Testament verses that I could bring in and could figure out what my opening illustrations were going to be and what my application points were. And once I got all that stuff together, I would then come in here in the worship center and I would film. After filming, I would then edit and crop and clip and produce and finally export and upload to YouTube to view what you're watching right now. And as I said, I was really excited about this, the potential it could have, how helpful I think it could be. Not because it was I who was doing it, just because it was what it was. But I also remember feeling a little nervous about it too. On the day the first video dropped, we were actually on our way to camp. And I remember sitting there thinking, what if nobody watches these? Who really wants to hear me talk from Monday to Friday? Is this going to be valuable or beneficial for anyone in their life? Now, I attribute these thoughts and questions of discouragement to the enemy himself, but I share them with you because I just want to be really transparent about where my head and heart was at the time. So much so that I was actually texting back and forth with my wife just about kind of where I was thinking and where I was feeling and what was going on about oh man, this drops today. I hope this or I hope that. And my wife texted me this: you're making a difference. Don't worry about how many see it. If it impacts one, you've done what the Lord wanted you to do. In a nutshell, my wife is drawing the conclusion that we actually concluded this series with on Sunday. God uses. He doesn't have to use us. He's not required to. He doesn't need us in any real capacity at all. But God sovereignly ordains the events in our life to present us with opportunities to take steps of faith. To where then if we do step out in faith and trust Him, that we can and will be used by Him. This is what we see as the book of Ruth concludes, the end of chapter 4, when we read about the genealogies that come from Ruth herself and what that actually means in the big picture of God's grand plan of redemption. We read this in Ruth chapter 4. Boaz fathered Obed. Obed fathered Jesse, and Jesse fathered David. God uses Ruth. Respectfully speaking, this random Moabite widow to be the great grandmother to King David. And not only to just King David, but to continue to fulfill his promise that from the line of David, there will be a Messiah to come to rescue and redeem his people. God uses Ruth. And think about that for a second. The position she has found to be used by God is really based off some real, what might be or come across as insignificant steps of faith. Like, she doesn't have to come back with Naomi to Bethlehem. She had Naomi's blessing to stay in Moab, but in some capacity, she takes a step of faith to remain committed to Naomi in return. She doesn't have to do everything Naomi tells her to do when she approaches Boaz that evening, but in some way, she takes a step of faith and does exactly what she's told. And these steps of faith, along with others, all place Ruth in a position to be used by God in a really, truly remarkable way. The reason today's opening illustration has to do with how this series even came to be is really twofold. Number one, it's my prayer that these videos have been a source of encouragement and hope and support and strength, and maybe have challenged you in your own walk with the Lord as we've been studying the book of Ruth together as a church family. But then also that story would also serve as an illustration to point out, like, this is kind of what it looks like to take a step of faith. I mean, I had no guarantees about any of this. I let doubts creep in and question if I should go through with it in the first place. I mean, I'm a pastor, but I'm also human. And these are like real life things that many of us will struggle with when we prayerfully consider being used by God. So don't think that it's just pastors or missionaries that God uses. God can use you too. And my hope is that as you've watched today's video, that maybe there's something that's going on in your life that maybe you feel the Lord is leading you to do, some decision to make, some phone call to have, some relationship to mend, a small group to lead, or some new adventure to begin, and maybe you've questioned whether you should or shouldn't. You feel confident that the Lord's leading you to do it, but there's some reluctance or some hesitancy. Well, my hope is that, like Ruth, like other brothers and sisters in our faith, that you would take a step of faith, that you would trust God with the results, and that you would do what He's called you to do. Because when we take those steps of faith, when we put ourselves in a position to be used by God, God can and will use us to show His love to others, to advance His kingdom, and to bring glory and honor to Him. Thanks for watching.